I have spent my entire professional life studying the cold, calculated logistics of global shipping. I understood the intricate dance of thousands of containers moving across the silver skin of our oceans, the silent heartbeat of international trade that keeps the world breathing. But there is a side to this industry that isn't taught in any university, discussed in any boardroom, or whispered in the halls of maritime law. There are shipping routes that do not appear on any satellite map, ancient currents that defy the laws of thermohaline circulation, and there are cargoes that no human insurance company would ever dare to cover. For their value is not measured in currency, but in the structural integrity of the human soul. My name is Julian, and I was a senior maritime claims adjuster for one of the oldest, most secretive firms in London, Vane Sterling Maritime. For over 2 centuries, my firm has handled the unlucky ships. We are the ones who receive the calls when a vessel returns without its crew, when a tanker arrives with its steel turned to glass, or when a ship returns with extra rooms that were never in the original blueprints. My grandfather, who held this position before me and eventually vanished during a routine inspection in the Baltic Sea, once left me a note on his mahogany desk. It said, "The sea doesn't want our gold, Julian. It doesn't care for our oil or our plastic. The sea wants a rhythm. It wants to sink its heavy, crushing heart with the pulse of the surface world until only one heart remains beating." I never understood the gravity of those words until last month, when the Vesper's wake was found. It was a massive ultra-large crude carrier, a leviathan of steel, found drifting aimlessly 300 miles off the coast of Point Nemo, the pole of inaccessibility, the place on Earth furthest from any land, where the closest humans are the astronauts passing overhead in the International Space Station. The ship was a silent, floating tomb. No distress signal had been sent. No signs of a struggle or piracy were found. But when the initial recovery team stepped on board, they didn't just find an empty ship, they found a biological nightmare. They claimed the steel of the deck had been replaced by something organic, something that felt like porous, calcified bone, and they refused to stay on board for more than 10 minutes. I was sent alone to document the manifest and assess what Vane Sterling called the ultimate liability. When the helicopter dropped me onto the deck, the first thing I noticed wasn't the smell of salt, but the smell of ancient, stagnant air, like a tomb opened after 10,000 years. The silence was absolute. It wasn't the silence of an empty space, it was the pressurized silence of a predator holding its breath. Every step I took felt wrong. The metal under my boots gave slightly, not with the flex of steel, but with the sickening softness of drying cartilage. The rivets in the hull were iron. They looked like rows of small, unblinking teeth embedded in the gray, leathery skin of the ship. I made my way to the bridge, my flashlight cutting through a fog that seemed to swallow the light. I found the captain's log, but the pages weren't made of paper. They were thin, translucent slices of dried human lung, preserved in a saline solution, and the handwriting wasn't ink. It was a series of precise chemical burns that seemed to shimmer when I looked at them from the corner of my eye. The last entry was dated 3 days after the ship had officially disappeared from radar. It read, "The broker has arrived. The contract is absolute. We are no longer the sailors of this vessel, we have become its fuel. The trade is being balanced, and the abyss is hungry for the interest we have owed for generations." The manifest attached to the log listed only one item: the breadth of the abyss, destination, all major ports of the northern hemisphere, value, infinite. Below the manifest was a seal made of black, vibrating wax that hummed with a frequency so low it made my teeth ache and my vision blur. I felt a primal urge to scream, to jump overboard into the dark Pacific, but the curiosity of a logistics expert is a specialized kind of madness. I needed to see the cargo. I needed to understand the logistics of a ghost ship. I began my descent into the lower holds, leaving the bridge and entering the central stairwell. The elevator was out of the question. The shaft was filled with a thick, oily substance that moved with a life of its own. As I descended, the temperature plummeted. My breath formed thick, jagged ice crystals in the air, and a layer of frost began to cover my tactical goggles. The walls were no longer metal, they were covered in a pulsating, translucent moss that beat with a slow, heavy rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. The ship was no longer a machine, it had become a living organism, a gargantuan creature of bone and barnacles masquerading as a merchant vessel. I reached the secondary hold, a space the crew had crudely labeled the archive in red paint that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Here, the laws of physics seemed to be suggestions rather than rules. The walls were lined with thousands of glass jars floating in a thick, amber fluid, held in place by some unseen gravitational anomaly. Inside each jar was a human tongue, severed perfectly at the root. As I walked past them, they began to vibrate in unison. They weren't screaming in pain, they were reciting trade data. They were whispering the prices of gold in the year 2100, the secret coordinates of sunken treasure galleons from the Spanish Armada, and the exact timestamps of every future maritime disaster for the next century. This ship wasn't just transporting goods, it was a floating intelligence hub, harvesting the secrets of the future from the ghosts of the past. The tongue spoke of a new economy, one where the currency wasn't money, but the very oxygen in our atmosphere. They whispered about the liquidation of the surface, a process where the oceans would rise not because of melting ice, but because the floor of the sea was being raised by the sheer volume of the things living beneath it. I pushed further down, into the third level, the sovereign hold. The pressure here was so intense I could feel my eardrums threatening to burst. The air was thick with the scent of gardenias and rotting whale carcasses. In this hold, I saw the passengers. They stood in the shadows, tall, gaunt figures dressed in the rotted finery of 19th century aristocrats. They had no eyes, only deep, vertical slits in their foreheads that emitted a faint, sickly green bioluminescence. They were the previous brokers, the men and women who had signed the black tide contract before me. They were meticulously sorting through piles of what looked like exquisite jewelry, but upon closer inspection, I realized the rings and necklaces were carved from human bone, polished to a high sheen. The surface world loves its status symbols. One of them hissed, its voice sounding like bubbles popping in a pool of thick mud. We simply provide the materials for the next cycle of vanity. You move plastic and electronics, Julian. We move the foundations of history finally. I reached the bottommost hold, a space that defied the physical dimensions of the ship's hull. It was as if the interior of the Vesper's wake had opened into a subdimensional pocket. The walls were made of black, dripping obsidian, and the floor was a shallow pool of freezing, black water that didn't ripple when I stepped in it. In the center of this impossible cathedral stood the monolith. It was a pillar of pure, light-absorbing obsidian, 30 feet tall, wrapped in heavy, pulsating chains made of sunken gold that had been compressed by the weight of the ocean until it was as dense as lead. Standing before this monolith was the captain. He was no longer recognizable as the man from his ID photo. His skin was the color of a deep-sea fish, gray and slimy, and his limbs had grown too long, with extra joints that cracked as he moved. His eyes were gone, replaced by two massive, glowing pearls that seemed to contain entire galaxies of swirling, dark water. He held a ledger bound in the leathery skin of an extinct leviathan. The trade must be balanced, Julian, he said, and his voice wasn't a sound, but a physical force that knocked me to my knees. For 5,000 years, your kind has treated the ocean as a resource, a highway, and a graveyard. You have taken the minerals, the oil, and the lives of millions. You have dumped your filth into our lungs and expected the deep to remain silent. But the deep has a long memory and an even longer ledger. The interest has accumulated. The debt is due, and the settlement will be total. He showed me the countdown on the monolith. It wasn't just for the release of the cargo. It was a countdown for the atmospheric conversion of Earth. The breath of the abyss wasn't a gas. It was a sentient bioagent, a microscopic swarm of deep-sea spores that, once released in the ports of London, New York, and Tokyo, would begin to terraform the air itself. It would turn the atmosphere into a thick, pressurized, saline mist. The cities of man would become underwater tombs, inhabited by those who were adapted to the new world, while the rest would simply dissolve into the brine. The monolith began to vibrate with a sound so profound, it felt like the Earth's crust was cracking open. I heard the collective mourning of 1,000 blue whales, a sound of such sorrow and power that I wept black tears. The captain handed me a quill. It was carved from the sharpened rib of a siren, and it was still warm to the touch. Every contract needs a witness. Every hostile takeover needs a logistics manager to ensure the transition is efficient. The previous broker has been liquidated. You are the most qualified candidate in 3 centuries. You understand the flow of goods. Now, you must understand the flow of blood. I looked at the quill, and then at the dark, swirling vortex opening at the base of the monolith. I saw the faces of my ancestors in the water, my grandfather, his father, all of them smiling with mouths full of needle teeth. I realized that Vane Sterling wasn't a shipping firm, it was a cult of brokers serving the ancient masters of the trench. I tried to fight it. I tried to reach for the emergency flares on my belt, but my fingers were already changing. My fingernails were falling off, replaced by hard, black claws. My skin was thickening, turning into a protective hide that could survive the crushing weight of 5 miles of water. My lungs felt like they were on fire, screaming for a kind of air that didn't exist on the surface. I realized that there was no escape. The trade was inevitable. The logistics were already in motion. If I didn't sign, I would be discarded, my body ground into the organic moss that fed the ship. But if I signed, I would become eternal. I would be the one who managed the end of the world. I would be the auditor of the apocalypse. The temptation was a physical weight, to know the secrets of every shipwreck, to control the currents that could sink fleets, to be the master of the black tide. I felt a cold, dark joy rising in my chest. The surface world was a place of noise and light and meaningless struggle. The abyss was silent. The abyss was order. The abyss was the ultimate monopoly. I took the quill. The bone felt like it was part of my own body. As I pressed the tip to the skin-bound ledger, the Vesper's wake gave a monstrous, metallic roar that vibrated through the hull and out into the depths, a signal to the thousands of other ghost ships waiting in the dark trenches. I signed my name, but the letters didn't form Julian. They formed a series of runes that meant the one who delivers the end. The moment the ink, a mixture of my own blood and prehistoric ichor, dried, the transformation was completed. My ribs cracked and expanded, my vision exploded into a spectrum of infrared and sonar, and I could feel every ship currently on the Atlantic as if they were insects crawling on my own skin. I looked at the captain, and I didn't see a monster. I saw our brother in arms. The cargo is ready, I said, and my voice was the sound of a tectonic plate shifting. The shipping lanes are clear. The ports are defenseless. Let the delivery begin. We didn't need engines. The ship began to move, pulled by the dark will of the ocean itself, sliding through the water at speeds that should have torn the steel apart. We were headed for the English Channel. We were headed for the heart of the world. I am no longer the man who lived in a flat in Chelsea and worried about insurance claims. I am the broker of the wake, the high priest of the infinite logistics. As you read these words, as you scroll through your screen in the safety of your home, I am navigating this vessel toward your nearest coastline. That thick, unnatural green fog you see rolling in from the sea tomorrow morning isn't a weather anomaly. It isn't a product of climate change. It is the first shipment of the breath of the abyss. It is the beginning of the great reclamation. Do not bother running for the hills. The tide is higher than the mountains. Do not bother praying to your gods. They drowned eons ago. Look at the sea tonight. Notice how the waves don't just hit the shore and retreat. Notice how they linger. Notice how they seem to be reaching for your ankles, testing the weight of your soul. The trade is finally being balanced. The ledger is being closed, and I am the one holding the pen. Subscribe if you want to know the order of the manifest, if you want to know which city will be the first to breathe the dark. But know this, in the world of the black tide, there are no customers. There are only assets to be liquidated. Welcome to the final shift. The ocean isn't just rising, it's coming home, and it is very, very hungry. The manager of the 13th floor was a child playing with toys. The real game is played in the salt, in the dark, in the crushing weight of the deep. I can see you now through the hull of my ship. I can hear your heartbeat. It's out of sync with the ocean. Don't worry, I'll fix that soon.